So, what we are going to do is, obviously the discussion really in general is about the challenge of living well together in diversity, but taking the religious kind of interreligious dialogue of faith as our perspective. So I shared with us some questions, and I will start by perhaps asking the first question. And what I said to my colleagues is that take a couple of minutes to respond to each, so we have at least 4 questions, and we will be able to do this in 45 minutes. The first question that came to my mind, and it's a question that's been talked about even internationally, and that is, given that religion is supposed to be now coming back to the public sphere in this post-secular era, even though I think there's a lot of contestation whether we really had any secular age, if you think about it critically. In the age of hyperconnectivity and mobility, etc., what role do you think faith and religious practice plays in bringing people together rather than creating divisions? And I'm happy for whoever wants to start.
Two nights ago, I was at an Iftar in Sydney, and it was my prayer time as well because the sun was setting. And I just went to that side of the room where people were praying. And Muslims did their prayer in their way, and I did my prayer in my way. And I was trying to be very present with God. But my thoughts were interrupted by a 5-year-old child who called out quite loudly, "Why is that man not bowing?" And afterwards we had a moment to just reflect on what we felt like to be at that Iftar, and it was interesting for me listening to the Imam talking about, very poetically, Sheikh Sonner talking about how God is beyond time, after time God will still be there, God was before the beginning, and of course that's the exact words are actually in the Adon Olam prayer. So in the hectic pace of the interconnected kind of world that's all about the here and now, faith helps us connect to eternity. The other point I'll make briefly is about the Sabbath. So when the sun sets on a Friday for me, the world stops. There's some people who know me and know that I'm fairly attached to my phone, but when the sun sets on Friday, there is no email, there's no WhatsApp, and that goes for about 25 hours. In fact, in the Torah it says that in 6 days you shall toil and do all your work. And of course, who gets their work all done in 6 days? But the interpretation of that idea is that when the Sabbath begins, it's as if the work doesn't exist. All the work that is not yet done is not important. I remember from Kuranda when I first saw him pray, and he'd do this action at the beginning of his prayer, kind of pushing the whole world away. And I guess for me, that's my experience of the Sabbath.
So you'll be able to tell from my accent, I'm not from around here. I'm an American by birth, but a Canadian by choice, and spent the last 26 years of my life living in Canada before coming here to Australia, Melbourne, back at the first of the year, so about 4.5 months ago. And so since arriving here, I've ridden the tram a lot, as I think many of you do. One of the things I notice is that it's so quiet on the tram. And the reason for that is because everybody's on their phones. And I mean, everybody. And you've all ridden the trams, you've seen that. And I think it points to the fact that maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there wouldn't have been that silence. You would have heard conversations in the background. People would be talking to each other. Now our conversations take place via our smartphones, via social media. And we live in a culture that where technology has changed the way we think, it's changed the way we communicate, it changes the way we commune as well. And so I think all of our religious traditions need to take that seriously and learn how to respond to that, because on top of that, living in a Western country like Australia or Canada or the United States, These are societies that are highly individualistic and highly privatized. And that creates another challenge for all three of our religious traditions. And so as a Christian, I think one of the ways that I kind of push back a little bit against this dominant cultural value of privacy and individualism from a theological standpoint is that, first of all, I recognize that there is no such thing as an individual Christian. Christians don't exist as individuals. Instead, they exist as a community of followers of Jesus. And I tell my students when I teach that you can call yourself a Christian because you're a member of a community of other Christians. And so I think one of the ways that we can kind of push back, perhaps in all three of our religious traditions, is rediscovering, reapplying, and allowing to rise up to the surface this notion that is deeply rooted in our religious traditions about being a member of a community, being a member of a family, as opposed to seeing ourselves as individuals, or as opposed to seeing others as a group of individuals. And so that's how I think I'd answer that question about how do we push back. As a Christian, it would be re-emphasizing the importance of religious community and the community of faith.
Thanks so much. Pleasure and honour to be here. Gee, when I look at my days from a typical day would start at 6 o'clock in the morning and it would be go until 12 at night. The only time I get to stop and gather my thoughts and just take a break is when I pray and then I connect to God. Even if I get to have lunch, my mind's still going 100 miles an hour. I've got this press release to send, I've got this interview, this presentation. I'll have a look at my emails, I'll also respond to that email within the next 2 minutes, otherwise I'll forget to respond to it. And it's just constant, And I get to the point where I feel absolutely mentally, physically, emotionally overwhelmed. I feel depleted. And when I can take time out and just connect with God and put everything aside, I feel nourished and I feel this sense that I'm able to relinquish the burden that I have, because in connecting with God, I understand that I don't have control over everything. I understand my purpose and my focus. So it makes me understand and appreciate that there is a higher being and that I don't have control over everything. And if everything doesn't go to plan, well, that's okay. As long as I do my best, that's okay. And I can let it go. And I need that to nourish my soul and to be the best version of myself. And when I find that inner peace with myself, I find that is when I'm able to seek peace with others. And with my family, with my friends, and with those that don't share my faith or have no faith. So I need that to be connected, and I need to connect with God and to connect with others.
Just moving away from, I think the first question was much more about religious practice and faith and how you can make sense of this increased connectivity and collaboration. Moving to where we are right now in this moment, and I think the Vice Chancellor mentioned some of those challenges that we have been facing in recent times, but they are all manifestations of this rise in hate speech and rise in violent extremism in general, across faith and ethnic and other lines. I'm wondering what you think individually, from your respective perspectives, what can be done to actually build stronger cross-cultural empathy and faith solidarity in our society.
Okay. It takes time. Empathy takes time. It's not something that could be at the bottom of the to-do list and still work. So if we want to see cross-cultural empathy, I think the first step is people actually spending the time to know the other. It also takes humility. It takes an openness to the perspectives of the other, putting aside our sense of what we are entitled to think and say and do, and actually experiencing the world through someone else's eyes. I want to illustrate what I mean by that. Just imagine the Northern Territory, bachelor in the Northern Territory. I'm sitting with an Aboriginal auntie, an elder, where the school had requested a leadership day, and we're going in 15 minutes. For some reason, this is a fly-in, fly-out kind of situation, so I didn't get a chance to consult. The consultation's happening now, and 15 minutes from now we're starting, or as some people call it, a non-sultation. Auntie Ellen, how do we make this leadership day culturally appropriate? And Auntie Ellen looks at me and says, you know, you have a tree. You have the tree trunk, you have the roots, you have the branches, and you have pencils. And I'm thinking, you're not helping. I'm going in there in 15 minutes and we're doing a leadership day, and you're giving me some kind of obscure parable about pencils and branches, and I have no idea what you're talking about. So, you know, Auntie Ellen speaks a number of Aboriginal languages. English is not her first language. Stupid me, maybe she didn't understand the question. She understood the question very well. So I asked the question in a different way and got some other answer that didn't make any sense to me. And I stopped and I thought, this is a Zalman, you are not listening moment. She told me something with the pencils and the tree, and I have no idea what she said. But I know that my question, this communication is not happening. So I pulled back and I thought, let me try and see the world through her eyes. I'm assuming that it makes sense to say to these 11-year-olds they can be leaders, but I don't know that. Auntie Ellen, does it make any sense to say to 11-year-olds you can be leaders? She said no. That's what the pencils are, the tree. Don't tell pencils they're tree trunks, doesn't make sense. But it was that capacity to be able to pull back and try and actually really shut up my own preconceived ideas, my own assumptions about what was about to happen in 15 minutes and really open myself to her experience. It's a skill. And it's a process. It takes time, it takes heart and soul. And if we're able to do that, then we can really learn and see what's happening in the heart of the other. If we're stuck with our own stories, we're going nowhere.
So those of you who are familiar with the Christian scriptures will know that in the Gospels, in the New Testament, Jesus teaches a lot using parables. And one of the best known parables that Jesus teaches comes from the Gospel according to Luke, and it's called the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it's a story of a Jewish man on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho, and he's ambushed by bandits and robbed and left for dead in a ditch. And along comes a Samaritan who, during the first century, would have been the sworn enemy of this Jewish person. And yet this Samaritan saves his life, pays for his medical bill, puts him up in a hotel, and takes care of him. And so it's a very surprising parable with a twist that in this parable, Jesus is illustrating who our neighbors are. Because he tells that parable in response to a question, who is my neighbor? And so I think it's an appropriate question for all of us to ask ourselves, who is my neighbor? Who are our neighbors? And in that parable, Jesus is saying that our neighbors aren't the people we expect to be our neighbors necessarily. And so that's a very important thing, I think, to take away from that particular parable. But again, it's an appropriate question for us to ask, who is my neighbor? My neighbors are all of you, if I'm going to take that parable seriously as a Christian. And so I think it's one that we all can take seriously. And when I was back in Canada last year, at our church, we had a book study on a book that was called The Art of Neighboring. Because again, in our highly individualized and highly privatized society, we don't do a very good job in this culture as neighbors. And we tend to keep to ourselves and not introduce ourselves to our neighbors. So in this book challenged us to actually go out, knock on the door of your neighbors, and introduce yourself to them. And I think that's a very basic, perhaps very easy way for us to respond to some of the extremism that we see in our society today. Now, as an educator, so my day job is as Dean of the Theological School at Trinity College. It's an Anglican college, and so we're preparing men and women for ministry in the Anglican Church. One of the things that I'm looking at is our curriculum, and I'm looking at it from a multi-faith perspective. I can't imagine graduates from our program going into parish ministry in the Anglican Church without having some training in multi-faith ministry in a multi-faith context. Because I can tell you, if they're going into the Diocese of Melbourne, this very vast and very diverse diocese, one of the largest dioceses in the world in the Anglican Church, they're going to encounter a multi-faith context. And so one of the things I'm looking at as an educator, and again, it's very practical, but it's what I'm paid to do during the day for my day job, is how can I integrate multi-faith ministry within our curriculum that trains men and women for Christian ministry in the Anglican Church. So just a couple of thoughts there.
Thanks so much. I came across some research recently that I found really fascinating. And this is from the Western Sydney University's Professor Kevin Dunn, who surveyed 1,000 Australians and found that those individuals who had a Muslim colleague, a Muslim friend, their attitudes towards Muslims was quite favourable, and those individuals who had no interaction with a Muslim had very unfavourable attitudes towards Muslims. So I think this just drives home the point that we need to get to know one another. We need to step out of our comfort zone, and I really do want to acknowledge the wonderful work done by the Australian Intercultural Society in spending, almost a decade or over a decade in bringing people from different backgrounds together. And it's such an exceptional project that they do, and I really admire them. And other projects like that as well. JCMA conference, we have the former chairperson of the JCMA committee with us, Imam Riyad Galil here, the wonderful work that's been done there. And I know from what we do at the Islamic Museum, I come across people regularly who were absolutely terrified to be at the museum. There was a 92-year-old woman who said to me, "You are the first Muslim I've ever spoken to, and I have been crippled with fear of Muslims for years. And now that fear is dissipated, and I feel this huge burden has left my shoulders." I read feedback forms from students who state that they had tried to hide from the school bus. They were so terrified to go to the excursion. Students that have, one student said that they cried all night not wanting to go to the Islamic Museum. But once they had come and had the opportunity to meet Muslims and to learn a little bit about Islam, it's completely changed their perspective. So I'd encourage everyone to step out of their comfort zones. If you're Muslim, perhaps go visit the Jewish Museum. If you're from the other faiths, come to the Islamic Museum. We have a Koori Heritage Trust as well in Melbourne. So let's take advantage of these wonderful cultural institutions. And the other thing I wanted to share with you as well is that at the moment the museum is doing a project with the Jewish Museum where about 80 students from Jewish King David School and Sirius College, they are getting together, they are becoming buddies, they are visiting each other's museums, they are learning from one another, and it's wonderful initiatives like that that I think are so important. And the Quran actually tells us in chapter 49, verse 13, that we have created you into nations and tribes so that you may get to know one another. So it's actually an Islamic imperative for us to get to know our neighbour.
Thank you, Shireen. Given that we have two members of Parliament here with us tonight, and I don't want to put them on the spot here, but I'm interested in you talking about conditions for successful coexistence and cross-cultural empathy and interfaith solidarity. What do you think is missing in the policy jigsaw, so to speak, in our society, because we tick a lot of boxes and there are many things that are working, but obviously there are certain things that we can do better. And whether it's from governance or leadership, or what do you think, from your respective points of view, needs to change or to improve?
I'll step out on a limb here, being the newest resident of Australia, perhaps in the room, being here only for 4.5 months. And I'm excited to know that we're going into an election here. I can't vote yet in Australia. Give me time. But I'm looking forward to watching the results with all of you on Saturday. I think you're right that the answer to this question is it's in part a political answer. And when I say political, I mean capital P political. So I think in the ideal world, a society that encourages a robust, multi-faith society without threats of violence, without Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, etc. It is a robust democracy, first of all. I think that's an essential part of it, from my standpoint as someone who's lived in the United States and Canada and now in Australia. A robust democracy where religions are not marginalized and religious leaders are not on the margins, and religious leaders and religions have something to say that's important in culture and are important and dominant cultural forces. And so I say that as a Canadian. I think Canada is a very robust democracy, but religions are on the margins. So it's not there yet from my standpoint. But I'd like to see a robust democracy where religious traditions and religions and religious leaders are front and center as cultural forces. Also, I think that democracy needs to be welcoming to refugees. And I say that again as a Canadian, where I think Canada hasn't done a lot of things well, but I think one of the things that Canada has done well for the world is opening its doors to refugees. And I think that's another essential part of that political will that needs to be there if we're going to achieve that ideal society that we're looking after.
So I'd love to see an end to the dogmas of politics, the divisive rhetoric that we hear reinforcing an us-them dichotomy. And I don't want to mention any names, but when certain red-haired politicians single out the Muslim community and tell them that they don't belong here, or that they should go back to where they came from, or describe their religion as a disease, you wonder the impact that will have on young Muslims who are constantly internalising these messages. And it would be pretty tough for them to feel connected to Australia. It would be pretty difficult for them to feel a sense of loyalty to Australia if they're constantly being told they don't belong here. So that's, that I think is quite problematic. In terms of the media, I'd love to see a more nuanced and less sensationalist approach to reporting. I don't think I'm going to see that anytime soon. So in answer to that question, I think what we need to reflect on, what is it within our ability that we can ourselves do? And I think we all need to make that commitment to have zero tolerance to any form of bigotry and any form of intolerance of any marginalised group. And if we can try and make that commitment, call it out when we see it amongst our family or friends or in the workplace. And just finally on that, I just want to share with you one story at the museum. There was a school that booked an excursion to the Islamic Museum late last year, and the school was bombarded with complaints from parents. There was a whole delegation of parents that went angrily to the school, to the principal, to the teachers, demanding the excursion be called off. There was a Facebook page created to try and stop the excursion, but the principal did not buckle. He did not buckle. He said, I am even more determined to make this excursion happen. And 50 students were supposed to attend that day, 38 students attended. And he made a strong message, an unequivocal message to those parents that your hate is not welcome at this school, and I'm not going to bump into that hate. So it's stories like that that really hearten me, and I hope that we can hear more and more stories like that. We can have the courage to stand up to that kind of bigotry.
Yeah, I guess I echo some of the things that you said. I think that politicians can set a tone that legitimises hate. So there needs to be great care taken in what's said. But also there are people reading between the lines. I think it's unhelpful when politicians talk about we need to be nice to Muslims because they're our allies in preventing terrorism. So let's be nice to those people, otherwise they're not going to tell us when their brothers want to kill us. I mean, we can do better than that. I think it's important that politicians are really careful about how what they're saying is being interpreted. I think politicians generally are quite skillful and understand what are being said. Give you guys a bit of credit. So that's one side of it, but the other side of it also is that politicians, we live in a democracy, and we need to think about why are there so many votes in stopping votes.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think by way of bringing this panel discussion to a conclusion, I want to give you, each and every one of you, maybe 1 or 2 minutes to provide some concluding reflections. So I want to really focus on the extent to which we think, as a society, there is a role for religious leadership to maybe complement and augment what is perhaps not operating very well in other spheres of society. So I'll start with you, Rabbi Zalman. What do you think about it?
I think firstly, we sometimes overestimate the influence of religious leaders. I think that there are people who are not prepared to follow. So it doesn't matter what a religious leader says in terms of a mainstream religious leader, because if the religious leader doesn't agree with their warped fanatical perspectives, and that religious leader is just a sellout. So as a religious leader, I think it's important for people not to expect too much from us, because we're actually not quite as cool as you think we are. We have a lot less influence, I think, than a lot of people give us credit for. That's one point I'd make. But certainly, religious leaders can show courage, and we must show courage in the way that we interpret, in the way we teach. We need to show honesty about those religious texts that could be understood to legitimize hate. If there is a context to a particular text, we better give that context, otherwise we can expect people to misunderstand it. So religious leaders, particularly speaking for myself as a Jewish leader, we've got a very, very rich and varied set of religious texts, and if those are not interpreted carefully, responsibly, they can be damaging, and on the other hand, if they aren't interpreted responsibly, they can lead people in a good direction. So in that sense, I think religious leaders have great responsibility.
So on that issue, I know the Muslim community have been, I feel, unfairly criticised for not condemning terrorism enough and not doing enough to find solutions to extremism and radicalisation. And for someone who's been involved in this space for nearly 2 decades now, nothing could be further from the truth. I can't tell you how many meetings with ASIO and AFP and big pole Muslim community leaders religious leaders have had. There have been countless media or countless press releases sent unequivocally condemning terrorism, and I notice I have Karanja on the table next to me here. Poor Karanja found himself having to be holding a microphone and unequivocally condemning terrorism for the last 15 years or so. In terms of sermons in mosques, countless sermons from across the nation unequivocally condemning terrorism. One woman got so frustrated that the Muslim community were being criticised for this that she actually put together a website, muslimscondemn.com, which is over 1,000 pages of unequivocal condemnations of terrorism. So I think it's a little bit unfair to shoulder the burden on religious leaders. I'm not saying they don't have a role, but I just think it's a bit unfair that we do tend to burden them with this role, especially given that religiosity is not a cause for extremism and radicalisation, according to many, many experts. Many of these individuals have never even stepped foot in a mosque before. And drawing on research from Scott Altran, who's an anthropologist who interviewed many ex-ISIS fighters, Olivia Roy, who's also a counter-terror expert, Robert Pape, who used to be an advisor to US security, they all state that these individuals become attracted to extremist groups because they are seeking a sense of belonging, a sense of hope, a sense of camaraderie, a sense of identity. So it's really not a religious matter, it's a social issue. And my worry is that when we focus so much on countering violent extremism, we forget some of the other issues that are so important in our community, like family violence. 1 to 2 women are murdered at the hands of their partners every week. ICE, the ICE epidemic. One imam I spoke to recently said the Muslim community in Melbourne don't have an issue with ISIS, they have an issue with ICE. So we need to really be mindful of these other issues that tend to get neglected because of our overreaction to terrorism and extremism.
So I'll answer the question from the Christian perspective. I agree with my colleagues that religious leaders, particularly Christian religious leaders, aren't always the coolest people in the room, and perhaps aren't always the most influential people in the room. But I do think they have a moral obligation always to speak out against violence and bigotry, and I think we all agree on that. And so I'd like to see more of that. It's interesting tonight. We heard about, of course, Christchurch, the tragedy in Christchurch, the tragedy in Sri Lanka. There was another tragedy which I know you all heard about, which wasn't mentioned yet tonight, but that was the shooting in San Diego at the synagogue. And the shooter was a radicalized Christian fundamentalist, specifically a Presbyterian, a particular type of Presbyterianism in the States. There are over 24 or so Presbyterian denominations in the US, and all sorts of different stripes and flavors. But this fellow came from a more fundamentalist expression of Presbyterianism, and I never thought I'd hear the words or say the words radicalized Presbyterian, but there you go. And the shooter was radicalized by some teachings that he heard in his particular denomination. And to his credit, the pastor of the shooter said, maybe we need to take some responsibility for the shooting. Maybe it's our teaching that helped create this extremism, this bigotry, this anti-Semitism in this individual. I can't remember his name, we don't need to mention it. But I'd like to see more of that in my own tradition. So to answer the question, yes, we have a moral obligation to speak out against bigotry and violence in all their forms.
Thank you for your sharing your perspectives with us. I think there is so much to be unpacked, and I'm sorry that we haven't enough time to perhaps go deeper into some of these contested questions, in particular the issue of leadership and religious leadership.